It was a magnificent empire where emperors wielded supreme power. Famous men like Augustus, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. They ruled an ancient civilization at its height of power and glory, a world of hedonism, drama, and debauchery. Join us as we expose the public and private lives of these rulers. The early Roman Empire came to symbolize the fine art of governing, producing such memorable leaders as Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony. But in 31 BC, the republican government, in existence for almost 5 centuries, had been dismantled. It was a dawning of a golden age. Instead of distributing the leadership between 2 councils as it had in the past, supreme power was now placed in the hands of one man, who became known as Caesar Augustus.
Caesar Augustus, son of a god, who shall establish the age of gold in Latium over fields that once were Saturn's realm. Virgil.
In 27 BC, Gaius Octavius Thurinus, better known as Octavian, would become the empire's most celebrated leader. Born in 63 BC, Octavian grew up in an Italian aristocratic family. He was a spoiled and sickly youth who overcompensated for his physical weakness by studying literature and mastering public speaking. In 44 BC, Octavian's grand uncle, the Roman dictator Julius Caesar, was assassinated. Caesar had always been fond of the young and spirited Octavian. Since he didn't have any legitimate heirs, in his will, Caesar posthumously adopted Octavian and willed him his estate. Against his parents' wishes, Octavian traveled to Rome to claim Caesar's estate and his name. Once there, Octavian ran into opposition from Mark Antony, Caesar's former governor, who felt the cocky teenager was unworthy of the inheritance.
You, boy, who owe everything to a name, Mark Antony.
Caesar's death and Caesar's legacy were a hot political item, and for a young man of 19 with, as Mark Antony said, nothing but a name, it took considerable courage to come to Rome. He was called Caesar Octavianus. The magic of that name gave him great power over Caesar's veterans.
Under the Roman Republic, Octavian couldn't inherit Caesar's former position in Rome. But as a blood heir, Octavian used the influence behind Caesar's name to establish a power base in Rome. Over the next 17 years, he built up an army and defeated his rival Mark Antony, who subsequently committed suicide. After years of bloody civil war, Octavian had restored peace and order to the empire. The Roman people rewarded Octavian with a new title, Augustus, meaning semi-divine. With the new title came other changes.
The change between Octavian and Augustus is a very, very important one. It's partly a matter of maturity. And so from this almost youthful image of Octavian, we move to a stern, mature, deliberately manly image of Augustus. Central, I think, to Augustus's legitimacy of his regime was the idea that Rome, in some senses, had been returned to a golden age, an age before sin.
Augustus became the first of a long succession of emperors who would rule the Roman Empire for the next 500 years. He was now sole ruler of the Mediterranean world, which encompassed Italy, Egypt, Syria, Spain, Gaul, and portions of Asia Minor. Settling into an office he would hold for life, Augustus was given the right to appoint provincial governors, propose laws, preside at public ceremonies, and control the Senate. During the Republican Empire, the Senate governed policies. Now under imperial rule, the Senate was stripped of its previous power. They did little more than run the empire's treasury.
The Roman people unanimously agreed that I should be elected overseer of laws and morals, without a colleague and with the fullest power. Augustus.
Julius Caesar may well have been the greatest Roman military commander, but his adopted son would become Rome's finest politician. Augustus was an educated man with a quick wit who knew how to work the Senate. Unlike Julius Caesar, Augustus was frugal and cared nothing about his personal appearance.
He was so far from being particular about the dressing of his hair that he would have several barbers working in a hurry at the same time. And as for his beard, he now had it clipped and now shaved, while at the very same time he would either be reading or writing something. Suetonius.
Augustus was hardly a military leader. He cared less about foreign policy matters and more about the domestic issues at hand, namely, Pax Romana, a policy of maintaining a peaceful empire. By the beginning of his reign in 27 BC, the population of people throughout the empire had swelled into the millions.
One of the great strengths of the Roman Empire is Roman citizenship. Unlike other empires or other societies, Romans are very inclusive in offering citizenship to newly conquered provinces, newly conquered peoples. Citizenship made the Roman Empire a kind of melting pot.
Roman citizens were allowed certain rights. Only children from wealthy families could receive a primary education. But only boys from wealthy families could go on to secondary school, whereas the girls were usually forced into arranged marriages.
The Roman family was a peculiar institution. The figure who held power in the family was called the pater familias, the father of the family. And he would hold all power. That is, he would hold power over his sons, over his grandsons, over his great-grandsons in the male line. He would have power over his wife, and he would have power over his unmarried daughters. He had the power to execute sons and daughters if he wanted to. He also had power to force his children to marry. He could force them to divorce.
Domestic squabbles were usually handled within the family. However, the private matter of marriage would soon become a public concern during the age of Augustus. During the imperial period, men were a prized commodity. Emperor Augustus knew this all too well, as he was faced with a declining male population. Young men were needed to fortify the dwindling army and to fill government posts. As a result, the emperor instituted policies that encouraged upper-class men to marry and procreate.
If we could survive without a wife, citizens of Rome, all of us would do without that nuisance. But since nature has so decreed, we must plan for our lasting preservation rather than for our temporary pleasure. Augustus.
What he did as a result of this was regulate marriages, so that if a Roman senator married early and had children, children was the key, he would get certain dispensations. He could run for office earlier. He could inherit in an easier way. If you didn't have children at a certain age, there were certain penalties. You were not allowed to inherit the full amount that someone might give you.
Women were also provided with incentives to marry. If a wife bore 3 children or more, she was allowed to inherit her husband's or father's property upon his death. Before Augustus took power, women had no property rights, nor were they allowed to live independently. But even with these incentives, having children was still a heavy burden.
Because giving birth was such a dangerous thing for a woman, and because so many women died actually giving birth, birth control and abortion were practiced in both the lower classes and the upper classes. We're lucky to have surviving a work by a Greek doctor from the 1st century who writes on these things. The methods of birth control, one of them was the rhythm method, but unfortunately he got the rhythm wrong, so it wouldn't have helped many women. As far as abortion goes, again, we have records of methods practiced. Some of them sound quite familiar, I think. They advise hot baths, they advise jumping up and down a lot, they advise lifting heavy objects, riding animals, things like that.
Augustus promoted marriage and family in an effort to reform what he believed were the failing morals of Roman society. However, Augustus would soon discover that his family values plan would cause a scandal within the imperial palace. For centuries, Romans freely indulged in their sexual pleasures and desires, partaking in lustful orgies or having clandestine love affairs. But in 2 BC, Emperor Augustus went on a crusade to clean up what he believed was immoral behavior. He instituted family values legislation, making adultery a crime. Extramarital affairs were no longer a private matter between husband and wife. They were a matter of the state.
If a woman was caught in adultery, she would not only lose a substantial amount of property, but she would be divorced by her husband, but she would be exiled to an island where she would live under unpleasant circumstances, away from her family, and most importantly, away from Rome.
Roman men were allowed under law to kill their daughters or wives if they were caught performing an adulterous act. Women, however, were not granted the same legal privileges.
There's very definitely a double standard for men and women. When Augustus introduced the laws on adultery, he himself was caught out in his own family. It seems that Augustus himself committed adultery, this is referred to, probably more for political reasons than his interest in the women, that he wanted to find out what their husbands were up to.
Augustus excluded himself from any moral judgment, but he enforced his strict moral laws on all Roman citizens, including his own family members. In 2 BC, the emperor's daughter Julia was caught in an adulterous act. Augustus himself sentenced her to spend the rest of her life on a secluded island.
Julia had a tremendous reputation of having wild orgies, of engaging in affairs with many of the upper class men of Rome, and Augustus exiled her to an island. She was never recalled from exile. She died in exile. But one thing that is interesting, I think, is in the first imperial family, the Julio-Claudian family, 5 emperors, 6 of the women are exiled for adultery, 6 of them. It's a way of getting rid of women who for some reason are dangerous. We don't know what the reasons are. There are sometimes suspicions that the men they're involved with are perhaps a threat to the stability of the government. And so the reasons, although they're exiled for adultery, it's not just that.
Augustus's wife was one of the few aristocratic women who escaped moral scandal. Livia Drusilla was married and pregnant when she met the 25-year-old Augustus. She eventually divorced her husband and became Augustus's 3rd wife. But Livia didn't sit quietly in the imperial palace. She was a shrewd, calculating first lady who wanted her son, Tiberius, to eventually take over the throne.
She's one of the very few women who is absolutely free from sexual scandal. There is not a hint ever made against Livia's private life in that sense. And in this way, she's very different from the other women who were surrounded by scandals, by sexual scandals, by stories of orgies and things like that.
Although Augustus was a philanderer, he remained married to Livia until his death. The ancient author Suetonius wrote that Augustus loved and esteemed her to the end without a rival. By enforcing his moral legislation, Emperor Augustus was able to influence most aspects of the empire, including the arts. But in time, some of his harsh tools of governing would fall out of favor with the citizens of Rome. The Roman Empire produced some of the greatest literary minds in history. There was Livy, who wrote 142 books on the history of Rome, and Virgil, the philosopher-poet, who wrote the epic book Aeneid.
One of the significant cultural ways in which Augustus established his power was by funding, supporting, and controlling a group of court poets who wrote the kind of poetry that celebrated Augustus's moral revolution and the new golden age which Augustus claimed to have brought to Rome. These were poets who wrote for money, who wrote under strict conditions of patronage.
Emperor Augustus dictated what kinds of books Roman authors could write. But not all writers abided by his decree. The poet Ovid wrote a book called The Art of Love, an instructional manual on how to seduce women, and more specifically, how to have an affair with a married woman. Augustus was outraged by the contents of the book. As punishment, he exiled Ovid from Rome.
There's, of course, an appalling irony in all of this, because one of the most immoral and disorganized, dysfunctional families in imperial Rome is Augustus's. But the persistent rumors about the imperial family must have undermined Augustus's own moral stance, must in some way have made him appear in public to be more of a hypocrite than he would have wished.
Augustus's morality laws proved to be unpopular and ineffective. The emperor found it increasingly difficult to enforce legislation that he himself disregarded. Augustus gained more support for his efforts to promote religious worship throughout the empire. He did so by restoring pagan temples. He was also praised for reinvigorating the popular cult of the Vestal Virgins. Vesta was the Roman goddess of the hearth and home. Her cult consisted of 6 virgins called Vestals. These virgins cloistered themselves inside a temple to care for the eternal flame of Vesta. The opportunity to become a Vestal priestess was a high honor. Girls 6 to 10 years of age were chosen by the emperor. For 30 years, the women would swear their virginity and devotion to the goddess. Violation of their chastity could mean imprisonment or death.
For the Vestal, who is vowed to chastity for her entire life, the punishment is quite awful. She's put on a funeral bier, she's carried through the streets while her family mourns and tears their hair, and then she's buried in a chamber underground with a few beans and some water, and she's left up to the goddess Vesta, whether she lives or dies. I think in every generation there seems to have been a Vestal Virgin scandal. This is something that recurs every 30 or 40 years. And within living memory, there had been Vestals buried alive.
During his 40 years on the imperial throne, Augustus put forward a litany of reforms that would uphold him as one of the empire's greatest emperors. He built massive roads and bridges, cleaned up city streets, and even instituted a fire department. He revitalized Rome, making it the most opulent city in the world.
I left Rome a city of marble, though I found it a city of bricks. Augustus.
In 14 AD, Augustus suffered a stroke and was near death. The 74-year-old emperor pondered over whom he would name as his successor.
Succession remains a perpetual problem for all Roman emperors. In a sense, they not only have to establish their dynastic credentials, their relation to Augustus, but they also have to show that they're the best citizen available to rule. And those two things are often quite difficult to bring together.
Augustus had no sons to inherit the throne. While he lay near death, the Roman Empire waited in anxious anticipation to find out who would be the next emperor, a position inherited by a son or blood relative. Without a blood heir, Augustus turned over his title to his stepson, Tiberius. Although his mother Livia went to great lengths to persuade Augustus to will him his throne, Tiberius really didn't want the job. Assuming emperorship was a risky business. Hostile takeovers, revolts, and family intrigues would become a constant worry. Of the first 12 emperors, 4 would die peacefully, 2 would commit suicide, and 6 others would be assassinated.
Roman emperors knew that there was always a danger of violent death, perhaps on the battlefield, but more likely through assassination, whether by one of their own officers or possibly by another Roman politician. Other senators were fairly often caught involved in plots against the life of the emperor. Some of these leading figures, indeed starting with Julius Caesar himself, were able to really take not much notice of this threat. Julius Caesar famously said he would rather die once than constantly die, so to speak, through fearing the threat of assassination. But others do seem to have become rather paranoid about the threat of plots to their lives.
Augustus himself had instated the Praetorian Guards. Like today's presidential secret servicemen, they were hired to protect the emperor at all costs. Anyone visiting the imperial palace was heavily searched, but sometimes even the Praetorian Guards would eventually find it difficult to protect emperors from their own children, who often displayed unruly behavior.
They had dynasties, but usually younger princes, having been brought up in the imperial palace with very few social restraints, would be dangerously unpredictable as emperors. These are the sorts of figures who are depicted as mad.
As the empire grew in power and wealth, many royal princes would go to desperate measures to take over the imperial throne. Most emperors would soon realize the threat of assassination lurked within the palace walls and within the imperial family. Caesar Augustus may have invented the term dysfunctional family, but the emperors who succeeded him perfected it. After 23 years on the imperial throne, Tiberius died. His successor was his grandnephew, Caligula, whom many considered to be insane. Caligula was said to have suffered from epilepsy and insomnia. His sleep disorder provided him with plenty of time to plot the executions of his mother and brothers, as well as commit incest with his sisters. He was an animal lover of the oddest sort, who adored his racehorse so much that he threatened to make him a consul. But Caligula's brutal governing tactics eventually got the best of him. In 41 AD, he was assassinated by his senators. Caligula's uncle Claudius was next in line to inherit the throne. When Claudius heard his nephew had been murdered by assassins, he cowered behind a palace curtain, fearing the assassins would also come after him. He was later discovered by the Praetorian Guards. Without a suitable replacement for Caligula, the Praetorians forced the Roman people to make Claudius their new leader. But for Claudius, the image of Caligula's murder would forever haunt him.
When he walked, his weak knees gave way under him, and he had many disagreeable traits. He would foam at the mouth and trickle at the nose. He stammered besides, and his head was very shaky at all times. Suetonius.
Claudius grew up a sickly child who was verbally abused by his family. His mother, Antonia, the daughter of Mark Antony, said her son was a monster of a man. As an adult, Claudius became a recluse, codependent on drinking, sex, and gambling. As emperor, Claudius was always on the lookout for assassins, managing to dodge 6 plots against his life. Over the years, Claudius's paranoia led to the executions of 35 senators and over 300 knights that he suspected might do him in. But little did Claudius know that his assassin lurked within his own home. Claudius had married Caligula's sister, Agrippina. However, Agrippina secretly wanted Nero, her son from a previous marriage, to succeed to the throne. She plotted to murder Claudius by serving him a dish of poisonous mushrooms. When the lethal vegetable dish didn't do the trick, Agrippina had his physician sneak a drop of poison down his throat. With Claudius's death in 54 AD, his throne was left to his stepson, Nero, who later confessed he had a hand in Claudius's death. Nero glibly remarked over dinner one night that mushrooms were the food of the gods. For helping her son ascend to the royal throne, Agrippina expected to be rewarded by being made co-ruler of Rome. But Nero had other ideas.
And then later on, Nero decided that his mother was rather overweening and had too much power over him, so he contrived to have her assassinated by some of his own soldiers and officials. So you can see from this example that there were sometimes very serious stresses within these imperial families, which could lead to murder.
Of all the emperors before and after him, none received more negative press than the Emperor Nero, portrayed as a self-indulgent tyrant and madman. During his reign, he murdered his mother, 2 wives, and a stepbrother. He even castrated one of his male lovers. By day, Nero got pleasure by executing and exiling countless men, women, and children. By night, he prowled the streets of Rome, getting cheap thrills from mugging women and stealing from stores. Nero betrayed friends and family alike, but the emperor also possessed a genteel side. He was a patron of the arts and dabbled in writing poetry, but his greatest passion was music. Never before had an emperor appeared on a Roman stage to strum on a lyre or perform in a play. The Roman nobles viewed his public appearances as scandalous, but no one dared to question his musical talents for fear of being tortured.
I have to confess that Nero is one of my favorite emperors. Nero is one of my favorite emperors because he's nothing like as bad as he's portrayed. What's central to Nero is the idea of acting, which of course is central to any form of politics, ancient or modern. Nero was a good actor, like any good American president. He acted his way through situations. For this, he was hated by the people who principally wrote the histories. For them, he's a man who goes on embarrassing stage tours of Greece, who sings while Rome burns.
In 64 AD, Nero faced a disaster. A raging fire swept through Rome, destroying much of the city. Many Roman people blamed the fire on Nero, that he intentionally started the inferno in order to level the city, that he needed space to build his own amusement park.
There's no need to think that they're deliberately set or that Nero was behind this one. In fact, the Great Fire in Rome cleared a lot of slums in the center of the city and allowed Nero to build his Golden House, a fantastic pleasure park, a pleasure park which we should remember was open to Roman citizens, was open to the inhabitants of the city. It's only, again, the aristocrats who rejected and objected to Nero's populist policies that saw this as some kind of extravagance. But this, I think, was a kind of Roman Disneyland funded by the emperor, jollity for all, but hated by those aristocrats who thought that they should have possession and control of the emperor.
After the Great Fire, Nero's popularity sunk to an all-time low. His armies and provinces turned against him. Fearing assassination, the 30-year-old Nero took his own life, stabbing himself in the neck with a dagger. Self-consumed to the end, according to his secretary, Nero's last words were, "What an artist the world is losing." In the year following Nero's suicide, the empire went through 3 emperors, each one quickly meeting a violent death. By the end of 69 AD, Vespasian became the empire's 9th emperor. Vespasian, an Italian from a middle-class background, was better liked than the 3 previous emperors who were from Rome's upper class. Vespasian began to rebuild the burned-down city of Rome once again. In addition to the construction of temples and public buildings, a grand amphitheater was erected. The stone arena dominated the city skyline. It would become an imposing symbol of Rome's power and eternal glory. In 80 AD, no other site in Rome attracted more attention than the Colosseum, an imperial landmark, an engineering masterpiece. The stone arena stood 4 stories high, supported by arched vaults, each decorated with stone statues of Roman gods. Inside the Colosseum, long, echoing corridors led into row after row of stone seats. Beneath the imposing structure was an underground maze of passageways and caged rooms. Commissioned by the Emperor Vespasian in 70 AD, the Colosseum was completed 10 years later by his son, Titus, who became Rome's 10th emperor. On opening day, 50,000 screaming spectators packed the theater to watch gladiatorial games, where half-naked men fought to the death using swords, tridents, and hand-to-hand combat. Admission was free. The games were a gift from the Emperor Titus to the people of Rome. The arena became a political tool used by subsequent emperors to win support from the people. And for most citizens, nothing was more thrilling than the sport of killing.
I think it's interesting to try to imagine what opening day here was like. The Roman citizens must have seen this enormous building rising up to the skies for 6 or 7 years. They must have watched the process of the building of this enormous construction. They must have known it was for them. It was their building given to them for the emperor. There must have been tremendous excitement, expectation. And then in the year 80, the Emperor Titus had great ceremonies. There must have been processions, there must have been music, fanfares. It was something that the emperor wanted the people to enjoy so that the people would respond to him, that they would support him, and that they wouldn't rebel, they wouldn't cause riots, they wouldn't be difficult.
Some gladiators volunteered for this dangerous career. They trained in special schools, hoping to achieve fame and financial rewards. However, most gladiators were typically prisoners, convicted criminals, and slaves. For them, the games were a way to win their freedom, or a dangerous battle to stay alive.
Sometimes they'd be matched against each other, so that you'd have the net man, who was agile because he wasn't weighed down by the heavy equipment, fighting a heavily armed gladiator, and people would put money, they would back which one they thought would win. There's also evidence that at some few periods in Roman history, there were women gladiators.
The gladiator spectacles were not only about man fighting man. Wild, exotic animals were imported from North Africa and Asia. The day of an event, hundreds of tigers, lions, and bears were kept in cages beneath the Colosseum. A system of pulleys hoisted the cages up to the arena level when the animals were scheduled to fight.
There was a very set program for the games in the Colosseum, which built up to a climax at the end of the day. In the morning, there were animal fights, fights between animals, where you'd have a smaller animal being attacked by a larger animal. This would then graduate to animal fighters coming in and fighting the animals. This then would graduate to another spectacle, perhaps one of the most horrendous of the spectacles, in the midday session, the so-called midday matinee, when criminals would be brought in to entertain the public, and the criminals would simply be executed.
The Colosseum was just one of the several venues that hosted these spectator sports. Since the days of Spartacus in 80 BC, similar stone amphitheaters were constructed in almost every Roman province.
I'm in the amphitheater at Syracuse, which is an interesting place. This amphitheater, as we see it now, is built in about 200 AD. One of the things that the builders of amphitheaters had to think about was protecting the spectators. One of the ways in which the spectators were protected from the wild beasts was by having barriers put up. And what we find frequently is that the barriers were rounded at the sides so that when the animals might try to jump up, they would slip down. What we also find is these could be used for other purposes. And here we have an inscription which tells us that this marked out the place, the seating element, the seating area, which belonged to the family of Statilius. This is the locus Statilii, the place where the family had purchased their seating.
As the games grew in popularity, each emperor had to put on bigger and better shows to appease the public's lust for blood and violence. Sometimes the Colosseum was flooded in order to stage mock naval battles. Years later, in 107 AD, the Emperor Trajan would host the largest slaughtering match. 10,000 gladiators and over 11,000 animals were brutally killed.
It's clear, however, that human beings are fascinated by blood, by violence, by murder. And in modern societies, we can say that similar things we have, such as bullfights, dogfights, the violence that we have programmed now into television. But I think in the end, the difference between what we see on the television screen, the violence that modern people are fascinated by, is a world apart from what took place here, and that is the very deliberate massacre and slaughter of human beings exclusively for the entertainment of the public.
But the gladiator spectacles weren't the most popular games in ancient Rome. Throughout the empire, frenetic fans jammed racetracks called circuses to watch their favorite chariot thunder to victory. Charioteers and their horses were divided into teams called reds, blues, greens, and whites. Sometimes 8 chariots would compete at one time for a cash prize and the sheer glory of winning. But the race was dangerous. In the fury, chariots often collided when turning corners. Any sudden collision could mean a loss of limbs or lives. While the Roman people enjoyed public spectacles, not all of them involved violence. Citizens attended the theater to watch a play or music recital. They also sought relaxation by going to the public bathhouses. Romans visited these ancient health spas on a daily basis to wash, exercise, or even conduct business meetings.
Visiting the Roman baths is a matter of going to a whole sequence of rooms, cold, warm, hot, which you may do in various different orders. Here, the great echoing room is the frigidarium, the cold room, and at the end is the cold plunge, invigorating dip here, and you're right up to your chin in water. The money and the interest that they put into baths shows the importance of bathing in Roman social life. Let's go through from the cold room into, next we reach a changing room. This room covered with stuccos, with figures of gods and men in armor. Let's go this way and have a proper dip. Here, this is almost like this is a thermal bath. Again, nearly 6 foot deep down the steps. So here I'm up to about my chest, but in the center of the bath is a heating mechanism, a very unusual heating mechanism made of bronze, a circle with another circle in the middle, and down below us there's another furnace, and this would be continuously warm, sending up warm water all around this pool. And you can imagine, you can easily get 30 people here together. And it's that fact of 30, 40 naked people together that raises what, for the Romans, is one of the moral worries about the baths. What happens when you're all just naked together? And one way they deal with that is to say, well, at least let's keep men and women separate. Let's have separate baths for women and men, because mixed naked bathing is too much to ask of any civilization.
Most Romans didn't have the luxury of owning a bathtub or shower, nor did they have such amenities as soap. So, citizens visited the baths often. They cleaned themselves by lathering oil on their skin and scraping it off with a curved metal instrument. In addition to bathing, the baths offered massages, body waxing, and hair plucking.
There's a marvelous description by the philosopher Seneca of how horrible it was to have a flat near public baths, because he says you can hear all the people squealing and shouting to each other, and the worst thing of all, he says, is when the underarm hair plucker gets to work and the squeals that come from people as they have their hair plucked.
The Roman Empire offered a variety of public pastimes for its citizens to enjoy. The rituals and traditions of daily life gave the Roman people a sense of belonging. Established by Augustus, the first emperors created a cultural tradition that would last for centuries. They reminded citizens that they too were part of a thriving empire, the glorious Empire of Rome. Within this eternal city, the emperors created a fantasy land for the public's amusement, a place where ordinary citizens could participate in the pomp and circumstance once reserved for kings and aristocrats. But in looking at this empire of expanding borders and colossal monuments, we must not forget this was a society based on bondage and brutality. The Roman Empire was a place of shocking contrasts, rich and poor, good and evil, the very best, and at the same time, the very worst of the human spirit. For the History Channel, I'm Joe Mantegna.